Good morning, everyone. Are we ready to start? We were supposed to start at 8:30. Now it's 8:35. Should we start or we wait for a few minutes? I think we should start. Good morning, everyone. My name is Farhat Mbaruk. As a member of the Paris Committee for Capacity Building, I would like to take this opportunity to welcome you all to the Capacities for Rights-Based Climate Action Day at the Capacity Building Hub. As you've seen for the whole week, last week, we've been having different themes. And today's theme is, or event is building capacity for rights-based climate action here at the Capacity Building Hub. Before we dive into thematic day, let me introduce you to Paris Committee on Capacity Building. The PCCB was established at COP21 in 2015, and the main purpose of the PCCB is to address current and emerging gaps and needs in implementing and further enhancing capacity building in developing countries. To support the PCCB mission and mandate, the committee launched a PCCB network in 2020 as a voluntary association of interested stakeholders engaged in capacity and climate-related capacity building. The PCCB regularly mobilizes the expertise of its network members at the international level through Capacity Building Hub, at this one at COP28. The Capacity Building Hub is a mandated event of the PCCB and take place each year at the COP. And this is our fifth hub at these COP conferences. The objective of this hub is to showcase the variety of capacity building efforts which have taken place over the year by sharing information, experiences, and technical capacity to further climate action to a large scale. To learn more about PCCB in its network, make sure you check out two banners with Q code that will redirect you to our webpage, which will give you more information on the PCCB network. Distinguished delegates, today's event is integrating human rights into climate action as a central to success of the Paris Agreement, not only to all parties that deals with capacity building and international human rights obligation, but human rights issue cannot be separated from climate change issues. Building capacity for rights-based climate action therefore contributes to realizing inclusive, sustainable, and effective solution for mitigation, adaptation, and addressing loss and damage, while ensuring interlinkages with other critical objectives such as protecting and enhancing biodiversity, health, and poverty eradication. Today's session seeks to emphasize the importance of adopting rights-based participatory approach, particularly empowering groups as agents of change, such as indigenous people, children, youth, individuals with disability, and gender rights advocates, to strengthen their capacity to participate in the climate change process. That means climate change does not leave anyone behind. With those few remarks, I would like to thank the Office of the United Nations High Commission for Human Rights and the Center for International Environmental Law for their role as a lead partners for today's event. Before I pass the floor to Benjamin, let me take this opportunity on behalf of PCCB to welcome you all and thank you for allocating your time this very early morning. So we do very much appreciate your presence here today. With those few remarks now, I would like to pass over to Benjamin to take us through today's event. Thank you very much and have a successful meeting. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you to the Paris Committee on Capacity Building and the UNFCCC Secretariat for facilitating and making this happen. This is the first ever Human Rights Day at the Capacity Building Hub. We've had the pleasure of working with the Secretariat and the Paris Committee for many years. We've done a lot of great things together, including developing an online learning course on human rights and climate change. But today, the day before International Human Rights Day and the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we're having the first full day on human rights here at the Capacity Building Hub, and we're incredibly grateful for that. I'm not going to say much, but I do want to just highlight a couple of things. With respect to capacity building, it really is a right. All children, for example, have a right to education with respect for nature. Access to information is a right. We all have a right to access information. And without capacity building, we can't have the empowerment of people that is required to address this terrible climate crisis. The climate crisis is absolutely a human rights crisis, and it's one that requires human rights solutions. This is a legal obligation, but it's also better policy. According to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, rights-based climate action leads to more effective and sustainable solutions. So we're going to have a great panel, and I'm going to turn things over to our moderator, Sophia Lee, who's a journalist and a UN human rights champion, to kick off that panel. You'll hear from people involved in different areas of capacity building, and throughout the day, there will be a number of wonderful activities. So before I do turn things over, I want to also thank the Center for International Environmental Law for working with us to bring this together. All of you in the audience for joining us early on a Monday morning. It's Monday morning. Saturday, even worse. Losing track of time here. We're very grateful. Thanks a lot.
All right, thank you, Ben. And thank you everyone for joining us so early on this Human Rights Day. Before we get started, I'm gonna ask you to join me in taking 3 deep breaths, because we're going to be talking about capacity building, and I think we need to be present with ourselves and our own energy first. So if you join me, it's very uncommon, but it's early, it's the morning, let's take some breaths together. So just join me, close your eyes, have your feet rooted in the ground if you can, or your back rooted in the chair, and breathe out first. Breathe out all the air first. Here we go. After you breathe out all your air, breathe in through your nose, hold it at the top, and let it out with your mouth with a sigh. Another inhale through your nose, hold it at the top, let it out of your mouth with a sigh. Last one, inhale through your nose, hold it at the top, deep sigh out of your mouth, biggest sigh yet. Here we go. All right, thank you. And please join me when, so I think that when we talk about these topics, we need to have the focus, because we talk about these topics in these conference rooms, but these are real applications that everyone here is going to share. We're going to be covering everything, as they mentioned, from gender equality to indigenous rights to disability rights. So first, let's start with Jandy Craig. Jandy is the National Indigenous Women Rights Alliance and is eliminating systemic racism against those most affected by climate change. So Jandy, please take it away.
Okay. First, I apologize. The pollution has triggered my asthma, so I am going to do the best I can this morning, and I'm very grateful to be here. So, Dakota, greetings, esteemed delegates and honored guests. My name is Jandy Ton Craig. I am White Mountain Apache from the United States, and the co-founder of Plume, National Indigenous Women's Rights Alliance, and North Region member of the Continental Network of Indigenous Women of the Americas. I give my sincere gratitude to the UN Voluntary Fund for Indigenous Peoples for making it possible for me to be here today. And thank you for the opportunity to address the distinguished gathering on capacity building for rights-based climate action at COP28. Today I'm here before you as an Apache woman, bringing a perspective deeply rooted in the traditions of my people, and a commitment to address one of the most pressing issues of our time, the intersection of systemic racism, climate change, and the empowerment of Indigenous women and children. Growing up, I learned about conservation not through formal education, but through the lens of ceremonial preparation and harvesting natural elements for traditional arts. The teachings were not framed as conservation, but to demonstrate love and respect for our Mother Earth. I was told by my elder, Mr. Jerry Glochet Sr., that the knowledge of conservation and taking care of Mother Earth is a responsibility, and it's our responsibility to share that with others to preserve the well-being of life's sacred path. Indigenous women, despite contributing least to climate change, are disproportionately affected, facing higher risks of mortality due to extreme heat. And yet, Indigenous peoples have long been stewards of Mother Earth, protecting 80% of the world's biodiversity with less than 5% of the global population. The urgent need for recognition of Indigenous vulnerabilities and contributions demands direct access to climate finance. To empower Indigenous women in climate advocacy, we must pave the way with opportunities for capacity building. If Indigenous women are not at the negotiating table, then we are not truly involved. Indigenous women must be equipped with the knowledge to navigate these spaces, to speak on behalf of our communities, and to launch and understand the profound impact of our words on the global movement. Capacity building is a key pillar of negotiations. As actors and rights holders, Indigenous peoples don't wait for the governments to fulfill their obligations. Instead, we claim our rights and educate governments about their responsibilities. This understanding is crucial in engaging the global policy processes where Indigenous peoples tend to possess more knowledge than governments do. Understanding the connection between climate change and human rights is paramount. Climate change affects all aspects of human survival, especially for Indigenous people facing systemic racism, historical marginalization, and high poverty. Indigenous people are on the front lines of climate change impacts, experiencing the effects of unsafeguarded mitigation measures, making the connection between climate change and human rights even more critical. Within the UNFCCC framework, Indigenous peoples have made significant gains with official recognition as an active observer constituency. More than 60 decisions explicitly reference Indigenous peoples and traditional knowledge. The gains include safeguards referencing the United Nations Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous People under REDD+, and the establishment of the Indigenous Peoples Knowledge Exchange Platform. Operationalizing human rights, incorporating Indigenous knowledge into climate change adaptation and mitigation, and building linkages at local, regional, and global levels are critical. Indigenous peoples must continue to advance our rights within the UNFCCC framework, utilizing tools like the preambular paragraph of the Paris Agreement on Human Rights and constituency-dedicated policies. In conclusion, the overall goal remains clear: to build consensus, to reduce and stabilize greenhouse gas emissions, enhance adaptation, and ensure sustainable development. Climate change mitigation actions such as energy efficiency, renewable energy, and sustainable land use must be implemented with a focus on equity and the unique contributions of Indigenous peoples. Together, let us forge a path towards a more just and sustainable future, one where the voices of Indigenous women and children are not only heard, but given the respect and consideration they deserve. Aheya, thank you.
Thank you so much, Shandy. We will now be going over to Job Morris from the San Youth Network, Botswana, to tell us the importance of the impact of Indigenous peoples in Botswana and the importance of participation of Botswana here at COP today. Do you have a microphone? these two here.
Thank you. My name is Job Morris from Botswana. I'm an indigenous person from a little village called Dikar. I work for an organization that is called the San Youth Network, and we focus on different aspects of San or indigenous people's development. But I'd like to take this chance to thank you for inviting me here to share my perspectives with you and to exchange at some point with you all of these delegates in this platform. I would like to also thank the Voluntary Fund for giving me the opportunity to participate at COP, which I think it is a very important COP so far. There are a lot of achievements that we have realized, and I'm very fortunate to have been a participant for this year's COP. Climate change is a serious issue for the San people, because the San communities are communities that are actually having a livelihood on the issue, on exploiting their natural resources. The impacts of climate change are severe, so much that there are actually disappearance of other animal and plant species within communities where the San people live. As indigenous communities, living as hunter-gatherers, this has become a problem. In the San Youth Network, we do a lot of capacity development programs to sensitize the San communities about the importance of adaptation and the dangers in which they will face if they do not conserve the environment. Just like all of the indigenous peoples around the world, San people consider themselves as the custodians of the environment. They see themselves as stewards who actually are responsible for taking care of the environment. For millennia, they have been conserving their environment, using that environment in such a way that maintains that environment for the future generation. There are different ways in which San people actually conserve the environment, but this has come into a challenge because they are facing a lot of political pressure. Forced relocations from their lands actually displaced the San people from the newer settlements. This has been a continuous issue all around in Botswana, and there's a lot of social injustice in Botswana when you talk about the San communities. A lot of displacements also uproot the San people from their lands, and they have no access to land ownership. Botswana land tenure system, Botswana, we have 3 land tenure systems. And all of those land tenure systems do not actually give an opportunity for the San people to acquire land and to utilize resources within that land. There are a lot of mining activities within the areas where the San people are living, and they have been forcefully relocated because of those mining activities. We do a lot of capacity development to ensure that they are aware of these issues, because the intersections of climate change and human rights cannot be separated. There are also issues of social issues that also come to play. And these are very fundamental issues that we bring to the San communities within Botswana, and to ensure that they are also part of the dialogue in any policy framework within Botswana. Of course, there are a lot of issues when it comes to a government to avail space or a platform for the San communities to communicate with them and to inform policy. So this is a problem. And we are trying as much as possible as civil society to ensure that the silent communities are part of the processes of dialogue. Participating in COP is very important for me because I have made efforts to have a conversation with relevant ministries. And this has necessitated the opportunity for me to engage with the Ministry of Environment back at home to ensure that issues of climate change also, the San people are part of them. And this is important, where the spaces, the opportunities that we get allow us to have this chance to speak with our governments, whereas they will never had that opportunity to speak with us at home. So I would like to, I can stop there and I'll continue as time comes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Job. We will now be moving to Elham Yousefian of the International Disability Alliance, who will be talking about the disability rights and national climate action. Elham, take it away.
Good morning, everyone. It just shows how committed you are to human rights and climate change that have been joining so early, so I appreciate that. I mean, I'm sitting here listening to my colleagues sharing experiences of indigenous people and like displacement, and I'm just thinking about when people who are displaced, people who are indigenous, are also people with disabilities, because, you know, people with disabilities are everywhere. World Health Organization estimates that 16% of the global population are people with disabilities. If you wonder why we don't see 16% of people around us are people with disabilities, then I'm going to tell you that, first of all, some disabilities are invisible. Not all disabilities are visible like mine. There are disabilities like autism, intellectual or psychosocial disabilities, or mental health conditions, hard of hearing people, and other kinds of impairments that are not necessarily visible. And secondly, because of the isolation, discrimination, exclusion, people with disabilities are facing a lot of barriers accessing participation opportunities, so they are not present as equal to their population in public spaces. So that's another reason that you do not see 16% of the people around you to be people with disabilities. People with disabilities are disproportionately impacted because of climate change, and the issue is that this disproportionateness is also visible in documenting that impact. So we don't have a lot of evidence, like I'm sure many of the organizations who are working on human rights and climate change even do not have as strong evidence advocacy programs on disability inclusion. And that's something that I really hope that today partners, organizers, and all of you in here would leave the room with, that you need to reconsider how inclusive your work is of people with disabilities. People with disabilities, as I said, are disproportionately impacted because of, first of all, underlying and pre-existing inequalities. 80% of people with disabilities globally live in poverty. And we just heard about the interconnection between climate change and poverty. So people with disabilities face a lot of barriers accessing economic opportunities, social protection, livelihoods, and when climate disasters hit, they are the first to experience the disasters. According to the United Nations Disaster Risk Reduction, when disasters happen, people with disabilities are 2 to 4 times more likely to lose their life. And this is a striking number, correct? And then many of them do not access safe evacuation, do not access accessible shelter, wash, and when, for example, food insecurity, which is one of the serious consequences of climate change happen, they are the first who are experiencing lack of access to food, and the last who are able to access food assistance program, because the distribution programs often are inaccessible. Another reason of this disproportionate impact is that people with disabilities, because of their underlying health conditions, may face barriers adapting themselves to climate change. So for example, we worked, my colleagues especially in Human Rights Watch and also McGill University, they advocated with the government of British Columbia in Canada to document the impact of the heat dome that happened in British Columbia in 2021 on people with disabilities. And they found out that 91% of those who lost their life during that heat dome were either people with disabilities or people with chronic health conditions. Because, for example, let me give you just 2 examples. We have people who have spinal cord injury, and for those people, the cooling system of the body does not operate equal to other people. So they face challenges, they keep the heat with themselves, you know. Or for example, we have people with schizophrenia, which is a mental health condition, and because of the medications that these people use, their body cannot tolerate heat. So they are very likely to lose their life because of heat. And also because the cooling opportunities, for example, cooling centers are not accessible. So many people, for example, say, I prefer to stay in my house because wherever I go, I'm not going to be able to navigate or even access the bathroom. It's very common sense to feel that you prefer to live in your own place with dignity and be able to use your own wash system rather than going to some place which is not inaccessible, even though it's like more comfortable from other ways. And also because of the poverty, many of them didn't have the opportunity to equip their houses with air conditioners and many other reasons. I mean, I don't claim that I have all the reasons. Another reason why this disproportionate impact is happening is lack of access to information. Because the information, for example, for a deaf person needs to be provided in sign language. So they understand that, for example, a heat wave is happening, what would be the consequences for them, what they should do to protect themselves, and what are the services available that they can use. When these information are not available in accessible format, like sign language for a deaf person, or audio description for a blind person, or easy to read or easy to understand for a person with intellectual disabilities, this is very, unfortunately, not far from expectation that they do not know how to protect themselves and they're at highest risk. In addition, we face the systematic exclusion of people with disabilities from climate policies. So together with McGill University, we at the International Disability Alliance did a comprehensive analysis of all national climate policies. And we found out that out of 195 states parties to Paris Agreement, only 39 of them do include some reference to disability in their nationally determined contributions. So 80% of governments worldwide do not even use a single word of people with disabilities in their nationally determined contributions. Even those who mention these 39 governments, only 15 of them, 1/5, actually just include some concrete measures of what exactly they're planning to do to ensure inclusion of people with disabilities. We also looked at the national adaptation plans, and we found out that out of 195 states parties to Paris Agreement, 65 do mention disability in their national adaptation plans, which is a good increase since last year. So in 2022, this was 46. So 19 more states added disability in their national adaptation plans. However, again, most of these are very vague and just say, yeah, we need to protect the most vulnerable people, including people with disabilities, without listing concrete measures of what they are planning to do to include people with disabilities. Only 26 states have some concrete measures in national adaptation plans. So I think this is already alarming enough, and I really hope that by building the capacities of governments, policymakers, by building the capacity of human rights and climate change advocates to make sure that they include disability. Colleagues who are working on women and gender, must make sure that their work is inclusive of and accessible to women with disabilities. Colleagues who work on indigenous people must make sure that their work is inclusive of and accessible for indigenous people with disabilities. Those who are working on intersection of climate and displacement must look at the displaced people with disabilities, so on and so forth. And at national level, the solution is to reach out to people with disabilities and their organizations, build their capacities, because many people with disabilities experience climate change, but do not know why they are experiencing these consequences, do not really have the information about climate change. So we also need to make sure that these capacity building activities are provided in accessible formats so they can also learn about climate change, learn about disability, and join forces to protect the planet. Because people with disabilities are not just experiencing the consequences. We can be part of the solution. No solution is acceptable leaving 16% of the population out. So by building capacities of people with disabilities, they can also join finding the solution for climate change. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Elham. I learned so much. Thank you so much. And truly, the climate crisis is the greatest exasperator, as we know, and it magnifies the most marginalized groups. Next up, we have Marissa Hutchinson. Welcome, Marissa, from the IWRAW Women and Gender constituency, who's going to talk to us about gender-responsive approaches to capacity building. Marissa, take it away.
Hi everyone, good morning. I'm happy to be here. Thank you for creating this event, CHR and CL, groups that I'm familiar working with, Benjamin and Lean. So thank you for this opportunity, and also thank you for inviting the WGC to be a part of this discussion. So I'll be representing the Women and Gender constituency in my capacity. I'm a facilitative member of the committee, of the constituency. So when we think about gender and building capacity, we want to acknowledge that first, that we don't believe that women don't have the capacity to create better lives for themselves, sustainable lives, but in most cases survive. But we also think about it in terms of a way of enhancing more specifically. So enhancing their capacity, but also to enhancing their lives. Because we also know that women and girls and other marginalized communities are the majority when it comes to climate change, and the way in which they bear the brunt of the crisis is more intense in comparison to men. Because women also hold that position of being the caretakers, the nurturers within the household. So when we think about building capacity, a lot of times we're thinking about how can we equip women and girls in situations, say, of disasters. An example I can use is specifically hurricanes, and I'm from the Caribbean actually, I'm from Barbados. And when we think about the way in which women take on the climate crisis in our region, a lot of times it's in that role of relief and recovery. Not so much preparation, but when they do preparation, it's to do with how can my family cannot starve during a hurricane if they're, locked away, if they have to move to evacuation centers, etc. But then they definitely take on a huge burden of the relief and recovery after climate events, and we've seen it over and over again. And a lot of times it's not just women in their communities, but also community groups that are often run by women. I wouldn't say specifically for the Caribbean we have indigenous people, but I do know in some of the areas where they do, say for instance St. Vincent, Belize, Trinidad, etc., women also within those indigenous communities are what we call in the Caribbean also like marooners or Garifuna people. They take on that critical role. So when we think about then again building that capacity, for example, some of my projects, well, under my other hat as ERAW Asia Pacific, we have a specific project on indigenous people, and we know the knowledge that they carry and the science that indigenous people carry and what they can bring to us. So what we do specifically is bring a very gendered perspective and also feminist perspective to the way they think about what environmental justice looks like. So from their perspective, it is about their land and protection of biodiversity, etc. But what we try to do is build their capacity and strength in terms of strengthening their leadership. In a lot of cases, what partners have shared with us is in the ways in which they don't feel that they have autonomy sometimes in their communities. So we think about then how can they take on lead in certain things in their community, whether it is specifically to do with how they get equipped for disasters, but also to an extension to climate change. We think about when international corporations, etc., come into communities and what that looks like, because we know that women also bear the brunt of those crises in terms of there's high or increased rates in sexual violence and abuse, and also child abuse, specifically to girls. So thinking about what that looks like, what it looks like to advocate specifically for their rights, youth rights, etc., but also community rights. So building their capacity more as a collective body. My colleague spoke about disability rights, and also in building capacity, whether with the women and gender constituency or with ERAL, we think also a very intersectional approach. So not just specifically women and girls, but also how can we include Indigenous women with disabilities? How can we think about the LGBTI community? How can we think about, you know, sex workers, etc.? Because if we don't encompass everyone, there will be people that will be left behind when it comes to climate change. So how do we then look at a community and say, we're going to support certain persons in building this society and leave out others? And that's not what we want to do in our approach to this work, because at the end of the day, we know the crisis affects everyone. And yes, developing countries are significantly impacted, but we have to think more from a community-based approach or like a gender lens, and not just who we think are the persons that represent in our community. And I don't want to add to what the others have added, but also too, when we think about displacement, and again, an example from my region, and I think it's very similar to the Pacific, who are, as we think about it, more advanced when it comes to the climate crisis than us in the Caribbean, but all small island developing states. We see the issue of migration and how it impacts differently the different marginalized communities, where a lot of time men are able to migrate, whereas women stay behind. People living with disabilities, Indigenous communities are unable to leave their lands, or they don't want to, and they shouldn't have to. But also too, in the issue of migration, when you know you have removed yourself or you have been displaced and you have to go to another territory, or more specifically another country, how you're not received. And a lot of times states are hard to understand, why would I need to take in this person, or how should I take in this person? And a lot of times I think what is missing in there is why this person needs to be received, and received because of their human rights. And I think that is also a challenge. But what is important is that we consider how we build the capacity of those persons in terms of, again, disability rights, more specifically Indigenous rights, etc., even child rights, because a lot of times children are displaced, and displaced without parents, or displaced without families. So how can we ensure that children are able to advocate for themselves, and know that they have a right to migrate, know that they have a right to be, instead of being knocked away in the system, which often happens. So our approach is very, yes, gendered and feminist, but also intersectional in terms of trying to encompass all the marginalized communities in which we engage with, but also to understanding that everyone has a right to exist. I think that is the issue sometimes, even within the frameworks that we maneuver under the different multilateral systems. Like, how can we ensure that people with disabilities have a say? How can we ensure that Indigenous people have a say, and understanding why they have this right to be a part of, or engaged in the different processes, and also integrated into different NAPs, NDCs, as was explained. But also, again, coming back to the communities is most important, because they're the experts of their own issues. And I think, again, the processes are so disconnected. Is how effectively can we do this? A lot of times states have no knowledge of what is happening to these communities, and they also don't make the time to seek the information that is necessary. So I think we as the communities have our role to play, but also governments have their role to play in it.
Thank you so much, Marissa. I thank you to all of our incredible panelists and speakers. We're going to go to Q&A, but off of what you said, Marissa, I oftentimes think about in the future, even if we do reach net zero, but human injustices still prevail and marginalized groups are still left out. And, you know, indigenous groups, disabilities groups, women, any of these marginalized groups are still left out of the equation, then it's not truly a just transition. So the climate crisis is a human rights issue. We're going to open up to Q&A. If anyone has questions, feel free to direct it to the specific speaker, and then we can go from there. I can pass around a microphone as well.
I wanted to ask our panelists 2 points. First, I've been moving around some of the different caucuses. We call it caucuses, the indigenous caucus, especially among the young people. And one of the biggest issues that they always raise is resources. And then afterwards, it's really giving the space for them to speak up. And for young people, especially for indigenous youth, we are very happy that that they have recently launched an indigenous platform for young people here, for youth, indigenous youth. But again, the issue is for them to come together. They needed resources, and I was wondering, how do you factor in resources in your work in terms of capacity building, in terms of providing space for the intersectionality of human rights that you are dealing with? Maybe you could share some good practices so that then we can also have some space for others to come in.
So you want to take another one, or can I answer on this? Okay, so in terms of what we do is, oftentimes we know that some of the very grassroots organizations or groups are unable to access those resources. So what we do, which is often hard also because some funders will not want to give funds to a bigger organization to pass the grassroots. But I feel like we do it well. What we do is we will consult with smaller organizations. So currently we have one of our biggest projects is with an indigenous group in Malaysia, a women's and feminist indigenous group in the Philippines, and then an indigenous women's group with disabilities in Nepal. And what we did was that we consulted with them first, taking on everything, the kinds of things they wanted to learn, thinking about risks and security for them, and also thinking about how to make it sustainable. And we came together, we wrote a proposal, and then we submitted it and gave opportunity while writing that proposal for funders to come back and say, or outright ask the organizations if they trust ERAW as a organization to hold a consortium. And we knew that we had built the trust with these organizations. And that's the other thing. A big thing about it when it comes to resources especially is trust. And when we wrote this project, we wrote it in COVID, and a lot of it would have been virtual, etc. And we realized that when we did pull the project together, we're so excited about putting this project together, we didn't factor in a lot of human capacity funds for them. And we even took it on ourselves to further divide those funds as the time went along to ensure that they had funds to fund their capacity to participate in the project, but also to carry out the different activities under the project. And happily to say, we never factored in COP within those projects, but every year since the project has started, those partners have been able to come to COP. They've been able to exist in COP in a way that it works for them, where they can share their voices. So I'm not walking around saying, I'm speaking for the group of Nepal, I'm not speaking for the indigenous people of Malaysia, but they've been able to see the efforts within ERAW, but also the efforts of coming together and collaborating on a project, especially for resources in a case where resources are very hard to come by smaller groups. I've heard partners say many a time, I've written to a funder 3 times and we've never gotten funding. So thinking about it in that way, a more collaborative approach to it is also very useful to ensure that these communities receive the funds that they need to do the work they need to do.
Okay, last question. Do you have, yes?
Thank you very much. I'm Adam Amadou, UN voluntary from Grand Tree. Thank you for organizing this wonderful session, and I learned a lot. I wanted just to appreciate first the speech, especially the people, including how to include people with disability, because always we, for example, for indigenous people, we are focusing ourselves on ourselves, I think, maybe forgetting more people who are more marginalized among us. So I think, thank you very much for that. And then addressing to maybe Jandy, not Jandy, Maurice. We are stressing always as indigenous people saying, okay, we are not only victim, but we are part of the solution. Can you give us a concrete solution, maybe using the indigenous people traditional knowledge, how you come to overcome or contribute to climate change resilience from San communities? Thank you.
Thank you, Amadou. When I was speaking, I avoided using terms like capacity building. I use capacity development because I acknowledge the existence of traditional knowledge. What we want to do is to develop rather on what is already there. Instead of building, it doesn't make sense to build someone's capacity when it's traditional knowledge is already there. So we understand that San people have lived with the environment for such a long time in such a way that they conserve that environment. The different strategic ways of their conservation, they have different conservation strategies in terms of when they hunt, when they gather resources, and what kind of resources, plants they have to gather, and how the method in which they want to gather. This actually is the way in which they conserve the environment. They also teach the young people how they need to behave when it comes to exploitation and exploiting their environment in such a way that it continues to be resourceful to them. So nowadays we have different issues, including violence, that has actually ensured that the San people forget actually how they need to conserve the environment. There are policies that have been, counter policies that have been put in place to ensure that the San people have to move away from their areas in which they call the ancestral lands. So if those counter policies are put in place, they put pressure to the San way of life. Their own livelihood has been put in pressure at the same time. So this actually caused a lot of problems in terms of conservation. But we try as much as possible in my organization to ensure that we talk to the San people in ways that the traditional knowledge that they need to actually utilize that traditional knowledge to conserve the environment.
Thank you, Mr. Morris. A round of applause for our speakers, please. Thank you so much. We're gonna hand it off to Ramchat now, who is from the UN Human Rights and Climate Change Focal Point for Asia. Ramchat, take it away.
Thank you very much. So, on behalf of the OHCHR, and I am from the Regional Office for Southeast Asia, working on human rights and climate change, of course, in Asia. And one of the things I would like to really briefly share after listening to all of our esteemed panelists is that the role of the government, and it's not only the people that need to have the capacity building. The government also have the capacity building. Actually, it's all the sectors in the society. Like when we start this work on human rights and climate change in the region like 5 years ago, the government, when we try to talk to them, they will always look so confused, like why do human rights have to do with human rights and climate change? We are the Ministry of Environment, we are the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, we are the Ministry of Trade, like why I have to talk to you on human rights? So I see a big gap and internal coordination within the government. And I attend COP, this is the third COP already. And one day I bumped into the party, one party from Asia. She's from gender division, from the Ministry of Social Affairs. And she said she have to fight to come here because her supervisor or the government doesn't understand why the gender have to do with human rights and climate change, why the gender section have to come here. So we see a big gap within the government as well. So I believe that one of the really important elements and is the policy coherence and coordination within the government and civil societies. And it's really important in terms of the capacity building that all the elements of the UNFCCC, for especially the Action for Climate Empowerment, the ACE, climate change education, public participation, access to information. This is really important to increase the capacity. So we need these policy coherence all across sectors or across bodies. So I hope that today in this Human Rights Day, we can raise awareness like why everyone, government, civil societies, National Human Rights Commission, private sector have to increase their capacity to integrate human rights approach into their climate action. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ramcha. We're going to hand it over to Lynn Van Dam now from SEAL to conclude this incredible panel on capacity building.
Thank you, everyone, for this amazing panel and also for all of you coming here so early in the morning. I'll just very briefly conclude and wanted to highlight a tool that we have developed with the Center for International Environmental Law and the UN Human Rights Office on ensuring that nationally determined contributions are human rights based and really building the capacity of practitioners at the national level to bring human rights into NDCs, because we do very often hear from climate experts that they do care about human rights, but they don't necessarily know how to integrate it in the negotiations into national policy making. So just wanted to highlight that toolkit is out there. It goes from land rights to public participation to gender to indigenous peoples, and it gives key recommendations on how to ensure that it's well integrated in NDCs. It delivers a checklist for practitioners and also examples from different NDCs on how it has been implemented, so good practices across the board. So just wanted to flag that before I give a very quick overview of what we're going to do today at this Capacities for Rights-Based Climate Action Day. There will be sessions on the importance of taking a human rights-based approach for ambition and for justice. There will be sessions on stakeholder engagement and public participation for climate action. We will be looking at toolkits, such as the one that I just mentioned, but there are many others out there to improve capacities for climate justice and for rights-based climate action. We will be hearing good practices on specific topics, such as gender-responsive climate action, such as the interlinkages between biodiversity and climate, and we will also be looking at the empowerment of marginalized groups in the context of climate action, thinking of youth and children, thinking of women, thinking of indigenous peoples, refugees, and local communities. And lastly, we will also have sessions looking at how to enhance the capacities of environmental defenders in the context of climate action. So I wish you very fruitful discussions today. A big thanks to the UNFCCC, to the PCCB, to the UN Human Rights Office for co-organizing this session or this day together. And just one last point before you leave this room today, we have left some of these lanyards that say human rights and civic space for climate action. You're very free to take those, to wear those, to give them to negotiators or to other people who want to show their support for human rights-based climate action. Thank you so much.